If your curiosity is endless, you're in the right place. Dive into the dark. Every crime hides secrets.
Okay, so true crime, right? I mean, it's a genre that just pulls people in. And when you think about cases that have really sunk into our minds, the Zodiac Killer, I mean, he's got to be right up there.
He really does.
This is America's most famous unsolved mystery from the late 60s, early 70s, Northern California. And like a lot of our listeners, I think we're both kind of drawn to these stories. You know, you want to understand these fascinating, kind of chilling things.
Totally. And I think what makes the Zodiac case so interesting, even after all these years, isn't just, the awfulness of what he did, but the way he messed with the police and the public. Those letters and ciphers, that's part of why we're still talking about him.
Absolutely. So in this deep dive, we're going to get into the murders he definitely did, those weird messages and what they might mean, look at the main suspects, and try to figure out why we still don't know who he was. So let's go back to the beginning. Where does this all start?
The first one we know about was December 20th, 1968. These two teenagers, Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, they were out on this road called Lake Herman Road in Vallejo. It was a lover's lane kind of place.
You know, that classic image, right? Like young couple looking for a little privacy, and then bam, this horrible violence. They were pulled out of their car and shot. And when you read the reports from back then, it's crazy how little the police had to go on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Back then, they didn't have the tools we do now, like DNA and stuff. Plus, there was no clear motive, no obvious connection, no witnesses. The crime scene was kind of a mess. Early investigations were just way more limited.
6 months later, July 4th, 1969, this time, Blue Rock Springs Park, still in Vallejo. Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau.
This one went down differently. A car came up to them, drove away, came back, and then some guy gets out and starts shooting into their car. He had a flashlight. Darlene was killed, but Michael, he actually lived, though he was really badly hurt. That's super important because he's the first person who actually saw the Zodiac during an attack.
Right, but this is where things change, and we start to get the Zodiac we know. The Vallejo police, they get this phone call. Can you imagine picking up the phone and...
It's chilling to even think about.
It's him.
A guy's voice, totally calm, says, yeah, I did the Blue Rock Springs shooting. And then, get this, he says he did Lake Herman Road too. And what really gets you is he gives all these details about both places that the cops hadn't told anyone. This wasn't just some random dude wanting attention. He knew stuff. Why do you think he suddenly had to tell everyone?
Maybe he was annoyed that nobody was paying attention, like he was announcing himself, becoming a public figure. And then, just a couple months later, September 27th, 1969, Lake Berryessa. Two college kids, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, having a picnic by the lake. Such a normal thing. Turned horrible.
This is where things get even worse and weirder with the Zodiac. Now he's wearing a mask, like an executioner's hood, all black, and it's got that symbol on it, the circle with the crosshairs. He ties them up and stabs them, like over and over.
And now he's really into this whole message thing. He writes on Brian Hartnell's car door. He puts that symbol, the date, like he had to sign his work. It's awful. Cecilia died, but Brian lived, and he could describe the guy. It's not just shooting anymore. It's stabbing. It's way more personal.
That change is definitely creepy. It's like he wanted something more hands-on to be closer, And then the last murder everyone agrees was him, October 11th, 1969, San Francisco. Paul Stein, he was driving a cab.
And this one felt different, Paul Stein's just working, picking up a fare, shot in the head, just in a normal neighborhood. Nothing like the other spots. And what he takes this time is Paul Stein's wallet and keys, but also a piece of his shirt covered in blood.
That shirt piece, that's what he sends to the newspapers later to prove it was him. This time, there were people who saw what happened, teenagers nearby. They could describe him.
And here's where it gets really frustrating. The cops, they get told to look for a black guy. They got the description totally wrong. So the real guy, probably a white guy like the witnesses said, he just walks away. Can you imagine how different things might have been if they hadn't messed that up? This case is full of those moments. This time, it's like the Zodiac got even bolder. The location, the witnesses, and then the cops mess it up. It almost seems like he was pushed to go public even more with the letters and everything after this.
Exactly. Those letters to the newspapers, that's what people remember. It's like he wanted the attention, wanted to scare everyone, sending ciphers nobody could understand, threats about bombs, bragging about the murders. It was terror, but not just from the violence,
And the ciphers, that's why people are still so obsessed with this case. There's the 408 character one, a high school teacher and his wife. They actually figured it out.
Yeah.
And it's dark, man. He gives you a look into his head.
That message, right? I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. It's chilling. He's not just saying he did it. He's saying he enjoys it. That's a huge red flag for serial killers.
Like ice water, you know? This guy is seriously messed up. And then there's that other one, the 340-character cipher. Nobody could solve it for over 50 years. I bet those investigators and all the people trying it home, they were pulling their hair out.
51 years, can you imagine? And then finally in 2020, these cryptographers from all over the world, they crack it. What did you think when you heard that? Did you think maybe we'd finally know who he was?
Honestly, yeah, I think everyone thought this could be it, you know, the big break. So what'd it say?
Well, it was a big deal that they solved it, but the message itself, it was more of the same. It said, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner." So it tells us some things, like he knew people were talking about him. He maybe saw himself on TV. He didn't care about getting caught. But no names, no clues.
Like he was playing a game, right? Even in code, he was always one step ahead.
Yeah.
But he sent other letters too, right? Like what else was in those?
Oh, yeah. He kept writing for a while. Some of them were really disturbing. He sent that piece of Paul Stein's shirt, the bloody one, to prove he was the guy. Then there were the taunts, like he was making fun of the cops and reporters. Then he said he was going to do more attacks, even said he'd target school buses. Imagine the fear that caused. And he'd throw in all these weird references to pop culture, like this opera, the Mikado. It's like he needed people to know he was in charge.
So this wasn't just a violent guy, right? He wanted to manipulate people, love being famous, even if it was for being a murderer. Okay, so we've got all these crimes, the messages, not a lot of physical evidence. No wonder people have come up with a ton of suspects. Who are some of the biggest names that have come up?
You're right. This case has had more theories than you can shake a stick at. People are obsessed. For a long time, the guy everyone thought it was Arthur Lee Allen. He was the #1 suspect for a lot of the investigators.
So what made them focus on him? What was the evidence, even if it wasn't a slam dunk?
So a few things. He had a past, some really disturbing stuff, especially with kids. And, get this, he had a Zodiac watch. Like, the brand name was Zodiac. Seemed like a pretty big clue. And he was near some of the crimes, that's what they said. They looked at his watch, where he was, and some things he supposedly said, like stuff from the letters. It wasn't proof, but it looked bad, you know? But then they finally test his DNA, and it doesn't match, which just shows you how much things have changed. Back then, they just didn't have the science.
Imagine how bummed those investigators were. They thought they had their guy. More recently, there's been talk about this guy, Gary Francis Post. What's that all about?
That's a newer one. Some people are saying they've found new evidence, like looking at old photos and stuff. They say he looks like the Zodiac, and maybe they can place him near the crimes. But a lot of people, especially the real experts, they're not buying it. It's still just a theory. But that's the thing about this case. People never give up. They're always looking for answers.
Yeah, every few years, a new name pops up, and everyone starts debating again. Another name that comes up sometimes, I guess because he was scary in a similar way, is Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. What's the connection there?
With Kaczynski, it's more about how they talk to people, the letters and stuff. Both sent coded messages, both hated the government, or that's how it seemed. And some people think their writing is similar, but there's zero proof that Kaczynski was involved with the Zodiac's murders. It's more like people see patterns, you know? Two famous guys who scared everyone, did terrible things, and nobody could catch them for a long time.
So after all this time, all the suspects, all the work, nobody's ever been 100% proven to be the Zodiac. Which brings us to the big question. Why? Why? Let him get away with it for so long.
A bunch of things, really. Like we were saying before, in the 60s, they just didn't have the tech we have now. DNA was brand new, and they weren't as careful with evidence as they are now. So maybe there's stuff they could test now that would solve it, but back then they didn't know.
It's hard to imagine now, right?
Yeah.
DNA is like the main thing in cop shows. What else made it hard to catch him?
Well, they also had a problem talking to each other. You know, the murders happened in different places, different towns, different police departments. And back then, they weren't good at sharing what they knew. So maybe one department had a clue that would help another, but they never found out.
Like that classic problem when different police groups have to work together. It never goes smoothly. And then, of course, there's the Zodiac himself. He wasn't exactly making it easy, was he? Nope. First it's shooting, then stabbing, then he goes after couples. Then a cab driver in the city. It's like he was making it up as he went along. The cops couldn't figure him out, couldn't guess what he'd do next. That's how he stayed free, you know?
Yeah.
He was too smart, too speaky.
So is the technology, the cops not working together, and then just how the Zodiac was. All of it added up to this mystery we're still talking about.
Mhm.
And even with everything we have now, all the science and stuff, we still don't know. It's kind of amazing in a bad way.
Totally. It was like the perfect storm. Everything went his way. But the Zodiac is more than just the crimes, right? He's like this legendary, almost mythical figure now.
Yeah, he's everywhere. Books, documentaries, and that movie Zodiac, the one David Fincher made in 2007, that one really brought the whole thing back for a new generation.
That movie was good, right?
Yeah.
It showed how hard the investigators worked and how much people got into it, like those amateur detectives trying to solve it themselves. And people are still doing that today. Oh yeah, the internet's full of it. Whole communities online dedicated to figuring this thing out. They go over every letter, every code, every little detail. He made this puzzle, and people just can't leave it alone.
And we keep getting better at DNA, and there's this new thing, forensic genealogy. So maybe one day we'll finally know who he was. But it's also possible he died a long time ago and took his secrets with him.
That's the tough part, right? You want to know the answer, but maybe there isn't one anymore. Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive into the Zodiac Killer, we covered the murders, those creepy coded messages he sent, all the suspects they looked at but couldn't pin it on, and why this case is still unsolved.
And we can't forget, under all this, the Zodiac was our real person who did awful things. Families were destroyed, people were terrified, and he did it all on purpose, made it a game, and that's why we're still so fascinated and so disturbed by it.
He knew what he was doing. It was psychological terror, but on a huge scale. He turned murder into a puzzle, and that's what we're left with. So one last thing for you to think about. We've come a long way with science, especially for solving crimes. But the Zodiac is still out there, unsolved. What does that tell us about crime? About how our minds work? What part of this story really stuck with you? The codes, the mistakes the cops made, the fact that we still don't know who he was. Maybe you're interested in checking out those online groups who are still working on it. Whatever it is, hopefully this deep dive gave you a better look into this dark and super interesting part of American history.